Do you want to take efficient notes during your university lecture so that once there is time to study, it just goes smoothly? If so, you're in the right place. Hi, I'm Mariana and I spent most of my adult life in lecture halls at universities. I have a bachelor degree in history and English philology. I have a joint Master of Arts as well as Master of Business. I've studied on 3 different continents and 4 different countries. So I know how important it is to take quality notes and that it can make you or break you as a student. Let me know down below in the comment section at what university do you study. And once you're down there, make sure you subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out on any of my future videos. Let's get started. You might have heard about the Cornell method, the outline method, mind mapping, or some other note-taking method. It might be easy to think that you need to find one perfect method that you're going to use throughout your whole study. However, I feel that you can't and should not use only one method throughout your whole studies. I think the choice should be made individually for each subject. Even the decision whether to take handwritten notes or type them on your computer should be made individually for each subject. And I know there are a lot of studies that say that handwritten notes are better for recalling information, but there are also a lot of studies that point out that the handwritten notes are incomplete and are missing a lot of information compared to the notes that people take on their computers or tablets. The reason is that as students, when we are listening to a professor and want to take notes, we need to make a very quick analysis of what's going on, what is the important information, how can I make it more concise, and what should I write down. And when we are writing down something, it's way easier and faster to type it down and write it by hand. So there is way more pressure or time pressure when we are writing down our notes by hand. And if the subject is quite easy and straightforward for you, it can be very easy to just write down some notes and you have all the information. But if the subject is a little bit outside of your comfort zone, it's a bit more challenging and you're getting lost from time to time, it's almost impossible to write down all the relevant information by hand. And it can be easier just to type whatever you hear and then later on sort those notes. So what I have done is at the beginning of a semester, I would come for the first lecture, I would come there with both my laptop and a notebook for writing handwritten notes. And I would start with handwritten notes and adjust either during the first lecture or after the first lecture. And it would largely depend on how the subject is interesting and what kind of notes or textbooks are available to us. Sometimes the professor would give us his notes, so I would not really need to take notes in the class. And that was a perfect scenario for me because I actually learn most when I'm not taking notes and when I'm just fully paying attention to the professor and watching the professor talk. For some reason, I remember what the professor looked like, whether he was smiling, what was he doing with his hands and so on. And that's how I remember information. So for me personally, writing down notes is actually distracting me from really learning. However, the case of a professor giving us full notes were quite rare. So if the professor didn't give us full notes, but there was quite a good textbook, and I know that if I miss some kind of important information, I can go back to it. I would take handwritten notes. I would also take handwritten notes even if the professor would give us full notes, but if I found the subject boring or the professor boring. Because in that case, I would just not be able to pay attention to the professor for 90 minutes or 2 hours, and it's easier if I actually take the notes because it forces me to pay attention to what is going on. I also had some professors that would not give us any notes, they would not use any PowerPoint slides, and there was no recommended textbook. However, we were expected to know everything that was covered in that lecture. In this case, I don't think that taking handwritten notes is the way to go. What I would do is I would take notes on my computer. I type quite fast. I am able to transcribe basically the whole lecture word from word. But I would not remember a single word afterwards. So this was purely creating materials that I can then go through later on when I'm preparing for the exam, but I would not remember anything from that lecture. I know that in these cases, a lot of students like to use a recording, whether it's a university recording of the lecture or they record the professor themselves. I tried it and it just doesn't work for me, especially if the professor takes a long time to get to the point. I just don't have the patience to then listen for 90 minutes to find, few points that I need to learn. I had some subjects during my university studies where the only reason I took them was because it was compulsory and I knew that I'm never going to use that information ever again. So my only purpose was to pass the final exam. And if you have subjects like that, then it's a good idea to familiarize yourself with the exam format at the beginning of the semester, so you actually know what kind of notes to take. There is a difference when you're studying later on for an oral exam or written exam or a quiz exam. So make sure you know how the exam looks like. At some universities, you can download the exams from previous years, so you can actually take a look and see what was asked before. Good idea is also to talk to previous students and see what they were asked. It's also a good idea to see if the professor who is teaching is the one who created the exam. If so, pay special attention to what he's saying. If he says something like, oh, this is important, it's probably important. If he, at the beginning of one lecture, repeats some information from the previous lecture, it's probably again something worthwhile writing and noting down. If the subject you're studying is something that you know you're going to use also after your studies, try when writing down notes also think about practical examples. It can be based on your past experience or based on what you might use in the future. Before I studied my Master of Business, I worked for a few years in a company. So when I then took the organizational communication subject, it was very easy for me when we talked about certain theories to write down next to it certain situation from my past that applied to that theory. And it was then very, very easy to actually study for the exam because I had all those examples in my head. In my entrepreneurship classes, I would often use the models or theories we covered and applied them to my small business projects I was working on at that time, or I did it for my past projects to see why they failed or what I could have done better. I also used special markings in my notebook wherever I felt that this is something I definitely want to use in the future. I made a video about the Fineman technique, so I'm not going to go into much detail here. If you're interested, check it out. But I think that this technique is great if you are studying a subject that's a little bit too difficult and you're unsure whether you really understand it, and you're maybe a bit too afraid about the exam that is coming up. What you do is, after your lecture, after you took your notes, you take a blank paper and on top of it you write the topic that you covered. And then, without looking at your notes, you write down everything that you can remember. And you use a language so that a person who has no knowledge in that area would still understand it. The thing is that sometimes we use some words, some terms, and we feel like we understand it, but when we are then pressed, we realize that we actually don't know how to explain it. And this technique really forces you to be able to explain everything. And if you get stuck, you go back to your notes, you read through it again, you try to understand it, and then once you feel you do, you go back to the blank paper and you write down everything you can. If you do it immediately after the lecture, you can also use this paper later on when you're studying. And in my experience, it reduces your study time by like 80% because you have very concise information that you yourself wrote down and that you understood at one point. So when, 2-3 months later you're studying for the exam, it's actually very easy to do so. There are subjects where the professor might be a world-class expert on it, but he is not the best teacher, and understanding the way he's explaining the topic is really hard, not to mention actually taking notes on that. So in this case, take a look at your class. Is there an A student in your class? And if so, ask them if you can look through their notes, if you can take picture of them, or just borrow it during the break so you can fill out any missing information. And sometimes those A students are actually better at explaining the topic, so don't be afraid to ask them to explain something. People say there are no dumb questions. Well, maybe. But it still doesn't make it easy to raise your hand in the middle of a lecture when you're surrounded by hundreds of students and ask a professor for clarification. And some professors are also not very approachable even during the break or after the lecture. The good news is that professors are people too, and most of them enjoy talking about their subject and are quite passionate about it. I once took a class and it was a bit over my head. I just was lost during the first lecture. The professor was walking around asking all these questions because most of the students took the subject already in the bachelor studies, so they had some background knowledge. I had none. And during the whole lecture, I was like, please don't look at me, don't ask me anything because I don't know anything. And if the students were giving him wrong answers, he was like, well, this is something that you really should know by now. And I was like, this is going to be really hard. Like, what should I do? And then I actually did something that I'm so grateful I did because it led to so many opportunities later on. But after the class, I went to the professor and I told him, hey, I studied for bachelor something completely different. I don't have any background knowledge and I was quite lost during your lecture. Is there a good textbook that I can buy and I can go through so I can catch up on the subject and I can then go through your lectures and understand them? And because I did this already after the first lecture, I didn't wait till, a week before the exam, but I did it immediately. He was quite understanding, and not only that he lent me a really good textbook that helped me to catch up on that, but he also was not really putting me on the spot in the lecture, asking me some difficult questions. Furthermore, during the semester, he would come to me, he would ask like, oh, did you understand everything? Was everything clear? And then it was very easy for me to say, well, I completely understand this, but in this theory, I'm just not sure, did you mean this or did you mean that? And it was very, very easy to get clarification from him. And when he was then searching for an assistant to work with him on a project, I was then approached and that led to another work experience. And I found out throughout my studies that asking for advice early on, asking for book recommendations, asking deeper questions about the subject is helping you to build a relationship between you and the professor so that later on, when you need help, it's actually way easier for you to ask and the professor is more willing to help you. Whether you're writing your information by hand or typing them on your computer, there is always need to write fast. The faster you write, the more information you can capture, you can pay more attention to the professor, you can actually take some time to think about what he's saying and what you want to write down. So it's a good idea to use abbreviations in your notes. There are a lot of common abbreviations that you can use and I'm sure that you're already using some. But it's also a good idea to come up with several that are unique to your subject. Each subject is a bit different and in each subject we are using different terms over and over again. But be careful if you get too excited and you come up with 30 new abbreviations during your first lecture and then you forget all about it and from the second lecture you're just using normal words. Then at the end of the semester, the first notes from the first lecture might be completely useless because you might have problems to decipher them. So what I did was at the back of my notebook, I would write down all the abbreviations I'm using. And then before the second and third lecture, I would just quickly skim over it so that I refresh it in my mind and I keep using them. And of course, if you are using them every single week, you then learn them, and studying from those notes is then very easy. When creating your own abbreviations, there are several ways how you can do it. You can shorten the word, just use the first few letters or even first letter. You can get rid of the vowels. You can use mathematical symbols instead of the word. You can also use symbols from other languages, like from Chinese and so on. Or if you are studying in English, for example, but your native language is a different language and the word that is all the time repeated is actually way shorter in your own language, you can use also that. I hope you found this useful and that there are some tricks and tips that you can implement into your own studies. Let me know down below in the comment section what else should I cover in my videos. It can be anything from note-taking, preparation for exams, university studies, or personal development. And after you post that suggestion, make sure you also subscribe so you don't miss that video. Thank you for watching this video. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye.